Okay, so last week we talked a little bit about the background about what vaping is and a little bit of the history of the development of vaping as a part of our market here in the United States and in the world. And this week I'm going to focus a little bit on the statistics associated with vaping. And then towards the end, we're going to get into some of the health issues, which we're going to talk more about next week. So in 2018, millions of middle-aged and high school students were reported being users of cigarette smoke. In fact, 78% of high school students and 48% of middle school students reported having used it at least once or using routinely. Okay, so that means that it is widespread. It is a serious issue, and that's why we're taking the time to talk about it. 81% of you thinks that one of the main reasons is because of the availability of appealing flavors, which is exactly why we talked about it last week. The FDA has now banished some of these flavors, and JUUL is the one brand that has been at the core of that increase of the use of vaping. So JUUL basically is a company that started as a cannabis company. That's marijuana, right? Now, their stated goal is to help improve the life of millions of adult smokers. In other words, here's something better for you instead of cigarette smoke, which is toxic. However, they have been the primary reason why thousands and thousands and thousands of kids are now hooked to nicotine at alarming rates. And this is the same company that makes Marlboro cigarettes actually bought a stake in JUUL because their own vaping device could not compete with JUUL's success. And that just comes to show you when tobacco puts money on it, that means there's something going good with it. Now, what exactly is in it, right? So even though there's no vapor inside of it, there's still small chemical particles that can pass into your lungs from tiny particles of metal, and also smoke itself, which is not something that's supposed to be in your lungs. Using the vaporizer also introduces several chemical compounds in your lungs, such as nicotine, and also volatile organic compounds, and other compounds which can actually have several severe consequences. And we're going to be talking more about them on the following slides. So one of the main things that is the problem with vaping is nicotine. It is almost in every single vaping device, and it's definitely in JUUL's. Now, it is a very, very addictive compound that acts like a neurotransmitter, which is one of the chemicals in your brain that help you communicate. It mimics something called acetylcholine. It binds into the same receptors of this natural chemical of yours. Now, because it binds into that receptor, you stop producing some of your own when you don't take nicotine. And then you feel the lack of it. And therefore, that's how addiction starts, because you feel literally the lack of that chemical that you naturally should have there. Now, it is the third most addictive chemical in the world following heroin and cocaine. It is no joke. All right, it is very, very hard to quit smoking. All right, 2/3 of users experience identical addiction to the chemical, and to the point that they find very, very hard to withdraw. The problem is that nicotine has severe effects in the brain. All right, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that in this podcast video. Let's see what they have to say.
So it's true, these products are very new, but there's a chorus of experts who say juuling poses clear health risks to teenagers. And that's because every JUUL pod contains so much nicotine.
There's plenty of evidence showing that nicotine is very harmful to the developing brain.
That's Dr. Bonnie Halprin-Falsher, developmental psychologist and professor at Stanford in the Division of Adolescent Medicine and Pediatrics. Bonnie studies how environmental factors influence adolescent decision-making around nicotine products.
The developing brain basically continues until somebody is in their mid-20s. So you take somebody who's 16, they have a brain that's still malleable. It's still plastic, so to speak. It's still developing.
Bonnie explained to me that two important things are happening in the teenage brain. First, there's a process called pruning going on. Bonnie says that's the brain shedding away parts it doesn't need anymore. And the second process is called myelinization. That's a process in which a sheath is created over a neuron to make it work or fire better. Bonnie says that because these processes happen during adolescence, teens have an easier time becoming deeply addicted to nicotine.
It hijacks the pleasure rewards of the brain, and the body says, I like this, and I'm going to change. And your brain actually changes to accommodate and to take in that nicotine.
And because it's addictive, there are consequences for people whose brains are exposed to too much nicotine. Specifically, it creates withdrawal symptoms and the feeling of needing more and more nicotine.
For teenagers who were never smokers in the first place, JUUL has been accused of pulling in young users with its high nicotine content and effectively turning them into customers for life.
Young people who are using JUUL today never planned on smoking a cigarette. So this so-called harm reduction, that's not the question with young people. Young people, it's fresh air versus vapes.
On top of this, e-cigarettes are still so new to the market that we don't yet know what other health risks could come up down the line. So a lot of parents like Meredith have focused their attention on restricting access, including cracking down on JUUL's flavored pods.
JUUL currently sells 8 flavors. 2 of these, Virginia tobacco and classic tobacco, taste almost like cigarettes. The other 6 are mango, cucumber, menthol, mint, fruit, and cream.
Now remember, these flavors are now outlawed by the FDA because they are appealing to kids. But as you saw in the podcast, there's a serious consequence to the young brain, especially because it's in development. So that addiction gets trapped in the framework of your developing brain. And even after, if you stop, your brain was built to need it. And it will never quite 100% recover. It would damage your brain capacity for life. And you will always really be requiring that extra kick because of your lack of acetylcholine that you've gotten used to while your brain was developing. It is especially bad during development stages. And one thing I want to highlight too about JUUL, as you can see what they were talking about, it was meant to help people stop smoking or smoke something that's not as bad. But what it's doing, it's appealing to people who really need to have a smoke in the first place, which is a lot of kids. And that's why it's a serious issue. And we have to talk more about it next week for sure, as we talk about other potential health risks associated to that. But before that, does JUUL even have a nicotine problem? I heard that e-cigarettes were not as bad. Well, the average e-cigarette is indeed much less nicotine than a normal cigarette. But JUUL sells their products almost like a replica of what you would get with a regular cigarette. And a lot of people don't know that. In fact, if you think about 200 puffs of cigarettes per JUUL cartridge, so it's as if that 10 puffs of a JUUL delivers exactly the same as one cigarette, and you can smoke the equivalent of 10 cigarettes as far as nicotine goes if you smoke an entire cartridge. So there's a lot of nicotine in it. And there's a smart way that they go about actually changing it so it has the same effect as it does when you add cigarettes. In traditional cigarettes, there's actually a free-base nicotine that has a very potent effect. But e-cigarettes don't have the same kind of nicotine, but the people in JUUL discovered that adding a chemical called benzoic acid to nicotine salts, which are inside of that fluid that they have inside of the oils that they put inside the cartridge, it would actually have the same delivery effect of a normal cigarette. But the problem is that benzoic acid actually has another effect. It is what we call a volatile organic compound. It vaporizes and carries the nicotine with it into your lungs. And this can actually have other bad effects, which on top of the nicotine itself, which we'll talk about next week. See you guys then.